Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. I have a very special guest this afternoon joining us today. Margaret Kimberley is a co-founder, executive editor, and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She's also the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. We're going to talk about that today. She has agreed to do a 1-hour interview with us. She contributes regularly to the columns LA Progressive, and she's contributed to the following anthologies: In Defense of Julian Assange, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 on China and the US, and Killing Trayvon's, an anthology of American violence. She's a graduate of Williams College and resides in New York City. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you because I feel like more and more that people are starting to think, at least in the ballpark, that I think, because I used to think that I was a crazy person, but I realized that more and more Black people are awake than I realized before, and that's always good to see. And I'll sort of let the audience know what I mean by those comments later, and you will too as well. It kind of goes into your book some, but we're going to talk a little bit about the way Black voters are sort of approaching things now, and historically how they've been manipulated over the times, and how we sort of have to question, have times really changed a lot as far as the psyche of Black people? And so that kind of goes into Prejudential, but I also want to talk about more contemporary stuff, starting about someone that I know that's very important to you, or who was very important to you, Glen Ford. Can you kind of tell the audience about Glen Ford and how Black Agenda Report came to existence?
Sure. Glen passed away. It was the first anniversary of his passing last July 28th. We were co-founders of blackagendareport.com along with Bruce Dixon, who's also passed away. But I would say he was the driving force behind it. I hope people, your viewers, take a look at Black Agenda Report this week, because we commemorate the anniversary of his passing, and he speaks for himself with the introduction to his book, which was published posthumously, the Black Agenda. And he explains how he came to be a journalist, his life story, interesting life story. He grew up partly in Jersey City, New Jersey, and partly in Augusta, Georgia. I'm sorry, Columbus, Georgia. Oh dear, am I getting it wrong? Let's just say Georgia. So he grew up in the spent part of his childhood and youth in the segregated South during the 50s and early 60s. He was a red diaper baby, that is to say, born to socialist parents. And but he was I like to use the retro term race man when talking about Glen. Black people were always in the forefront of his thought. And his father was a DJ in Georgia, and Glen was on the air from the time he was a kid, and you could tell, he had the voice, he had everything. Was Vietnam era vet. He was a Black Panther. So all of those things combined to make him a very unique journalist and activist and Marxist. And you could see it in his writings. And one of the things I hope people look at in Black Agenda Report this week, we have a segment of Glen speaking at an event, a teach-in about Ukraine in 2014, shortly after the US-backed coup. And it was like he had a crystal ball. I think we called it that, Glen Ford's Ukrainian crystal ball. But that's what happens when your analysis is so sharp, that he could explain why the US had tried, or still trying, to use Ukraine as a weapon against Russia, what that impact would be around the world. And it's as though he was speaking in 2022. That's how sharp his analysis was.
100%. And I know that some of my viewers, some may be more familiar than others with Black Agenda Report and Black Agenda Radio. As far as you personally, what's sort of your backstory as far as how you got into politics, your political thought processes, have they changed over the years? How did that come about?
Well, a lot of change. I grew up as, like most Black people, a Democrat, like, on the liberal quote unquote side. But being exposed to Glen, I started writing, we wrote for a site called Black Commentator. I wanted to submit something. I submitted, it was like 2003 or something like that. And Glen was very impressed. I was a new writer. And I like to tell that story because it tells you the importance of encouraging people to do new things, to do things they may not have done before. But for a variety of reasons, we decided to strike out on our own with Bruce Dixon, and in 2006 started Black Agenda Report. But my politics became more and more left as I exposed myself to Glen and to Bruce and to other people and organizations, and I finally came to understand why this hope for reform, which I think is what it amounts to be a Democrat, that there can be some kind of reform, that the party can improve itself if it just gets better people, or if we work on the inside. No, none of that. It's not going to do. This is a crucial moment in history. And but the state's in crisis. Capitalism is in crisis.
Yes, it is.
The so-called democracies, bourgeois democracies, are in crisis, and everything they do to try to change their situation makes things worse for them. And that's because the US insists on being a hegemon. So instead of accepting that China is the Chinese economy will surpass that of the US, and working with China and living with it, they want to try to destroy China. Instead of accepting that Russia's a sovereign state with a lot of resources and they want to run their own country as they wish. No, they have a coup in Ukraine, and Biden comes into office and instigates what he hopes will be a little war, but the Russians call their bluff. It's all blown up in their faces. Ukraine is losing, by the way, and they but the corporate media are like State Department spokespeople, members of Congress, and it's bipartisan. All these initiatives are bipartisan. So the progressives sound like, when it comes to Ukraine, that may as well be, AOC sounds like Mitch McConnell. They don't say anything differently about the US role in Ukraine. So having lived through these changes, having had the guidance of Glen and other people I've been fortunate enough to meet, I'm now a lot more left wing, and I understand why reformism can't work. We need revolutionary changes here and around the world, which is a difficult thing to say. What does that mean? Everybody's not ready for that. There's a lot of propaganda. Americans are very much indoctrinated, and we're told that the system we have is the best deal you can get. And so you shouldn't ask any questions, shouldn't complain. And what about the Republicans? And as far as Black people are concerned, as Glen used to say, we're in the trap of the duopoly, where the organizing principle of the US is white supremacy. So naturally, one party is the Black People's Party, one party is the White People's Party. They switched places in the 60s. It was from the Civil War until well into the 20th century. The Democrats were the party of the segregated South. Republicans were the party of Lincoln. Sometimes that would change, but basically in the 1960s, there was a complete switch. The Southern strategy, which is the white people's strategy, took over for the Republicans. And the last Democrat to get a majority of the white vote was Lyndon Johnson in 1964 in a presidential election. And ever since then, most white people have voted for Republicans, and Black people feel tied to the Democrats. Trump's election did not help that any. he was this, the ultimate nightmare, someone who was elected because he was openly racist, because he so openly asserted what white people want for themselves. And so now this bad situation we always had in thinking we had no choice but to follow Democrats has only gotten stronger. So you can have somebody like Joe Biden, who has been a right-wing Democrat his entire political life, who bragged about putting Black people in jail, just like Bill Clinton did.
Of course, yeah.
Who's the one who was responsible, who took credit for shepherding the crime bill through the Senate in the 90s, with his stories about corn pop and his, I don't know if you remember, someone leaked a video of his meeting with people called civil rights leaders. At the time of the transition, his rudeness, his demeaning them, was very clear where he stood. And what have we gotten with Joe Biden? And we were told it was so important to get rid of Trump. But what do we have with Biden? We have we had a stimulus bill for a year. So for a year, people got extra unemployment. People with kids got a child tax credit. But the Build Back Better bill, which was supposed to build on that, is dead.
Yeah.
And they blame certain Democrats for it, when in reality, it's the entire system. And Americans' oligarchy will not stand for the people to get any help at all. So it's over, it's dead. And I touched on with Ukraine. Now Biden, not content to have had Ukraine blow up in his face, they're trying to start something with China and send Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. And it's so is he better than Trump? I don't know how. They don't undo. Democrats never undo what Republicans do once they get into office. They allowed, for decades, they allowed Republicans to take over these states. When Obama was president, Democrats lost about 1,000 seats in Congress and across state legislatures. That determines how lines are drawn. That allows them to gerrymander. It allows them for Republicans to have the advantage. It means once Roe v. Wade is overturned, states after state after state can say abortion is now illegal. And that's partly the fault of the Democrats. They never acted upon. They had the best chance when Obama was first president to enact legislation and codify Roe v. Wade, but he chose not to do it after saying he would. He got into office and said, it's not my highest priority. It wasn't a low priority. It wasn't any priority for him. So it's very difficult time, but people have to, and I think more people are, you're right about that, thinking outside of the box, so to speak, thinking outside of the political system to see that we're not doing well as a group, that the nation isn't doing well. I mean, the minimum wage hasn't gone up for decades. Homelessness going up. The only people who get more money are the military industrial complex, $50 billion to Ukraine alone. Actually, to Raytheon and Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and whomever. So that's where we are right now, and that's where following the Democrats has gotten us.
I think there's a lot what you said that I obviously agree with a lot of what you said, but I kind of want to expand on a couple of points you made about this whole idea. I personally call them Dempublicans. I don't even make a distinction between them, because my friends think I'm making a joke of it, but I'm serious that the two parties are basically collaborating together. They've always done this. And under this whole idea of it's really a one-party state, but they use this duopoly mess to sort of weird these type of people versus these type of people, when they're all corporatists, they're all super capitalists, they all benefit off the military industrial complex, the police state, expanding it. If anything, the Democrats make they do a better job of hiding it. And so people can still smile when you have your LGBTQ flag in the background and you're still doing the Republicans' work for them.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why people see that as like, Kiko, are you really sure about that? How do you not see that? But they use these people like the Kristen Cinemas and the Joe Manchins almost as characters in a movie. And they're just playing the role that they have to play in order to stop whatever they need to stop when it's convenient.
Well, they're the, the bad cops, as you say in a movie, there's a good cop and a bad cop. They both do the same thing. One makes you feel more comfortable. It's like, I'm going to protect you from the bad cop over there. He's the guy who will, hit you in the head with the billy club, but not me. So they play the bad cop role. But we should not be fooled. I'm sure there are other Democrats who are relieved that somebody else plays that part and they get to pretend, oh, I'd help you out if it weren't for Manchin and Cinema. But none of them are helping us out. None of them step up. None of them push back, because they all, look at how you get to be a senator. Here in New York, you have to raise a minimum of $30 million to have a credible run as a United States senator. Actually, I think I'm behind. I think it's more than that now. I could be a couple decades behind, but it's a huge amount of money. And what does that tell you? It's like, who's going to have access? Are we going to have access, or is it the super PACs and the people who bundle the checks? No, they're the ones who have access. So you'll see the Republicans. So they will say, so Trump will say he's not going to abide by a climate agreement. And everybody says, oh my God, this is so terrible. You have to have a Democrat in. So Biden joins the climate agreement, but what do? They're still drilling on public land, still drilling in the Arctic, still refusing to help the poorer nations of the global South, the ones who are living with the worst impacts of climate change. So none of that changes when you have a Democrat in office. And now with the failure of Roe v. Wade, and the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. Democrats didn't do anything about that either. So these issues that are supposed to be these wedge issues that, and let's talk about the Supreme Court. If anybody argued against the Democrats or said I can't support them, then it was, well, what about the Supreme Court? If you can't think of anything else to protect the country, you've got to have Democrats in. Well, what do we get? Obama messed up. He didn't push out, what's her name? Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Mm-hmm.
He should have retired. They should have pushed her out. She was already 80, had already had cancer. He knew they were in danger of losing the Senate and that she should leave. Mm-hmm. But they left it alone. I think they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. So he leaves that alone. Then they don't do the recess appointment with Merrick Garland. And then Hillary Clinton messes up and loses. So what's the point? Right now it's like, well, all these things that you said, well, the Democrats will make abortion legal. No. Well, the Democrats are the ones to save and protect the federal judiciary. No. So what's the reason now?
Mm-hmm. See, my whole thing would have been, and I had a question about a term that you use almost all the time, and I think my audience would be curious about it too. The whole thing about this pushing left, pushing right, is that my whole thing was that I knew I wasn't going to vote for either party. I haven't since 2008. Since Obama won, I voted for him. I was duped. I thought he would do something, didn't do anything, and I sort of got disillusioned ever since then. But my whole thing is like, as an outsider, quote unquote, if Trump won again, what would that do? Would that make the Democrats go left? And so you can argue that against them. If he wins again, are you guys actually going to do something? And I really don't think they would have done anything. Even if he would have won again, they still wouldn't have done anything. But even in spite of George Floyd and everything else that happened, leading up to the presidency, but there's just always some sort of excuse, it seems. And they have all the tools behind them. They have all the media corporations behind them. Anyone with any sort of financial backing have their voice. They have their voice and their paycheck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Will Trump run again? This focus on Trump has got to stop. It's like, I've never seen a former president in the news so much. And they use him to excuse their lack of action. It's always, look, Trump, so don't ask us anything. Trump could be president against these January 6th hearings, which I've pretty much ignored. They're not going to touch him. If they charge a sitting president, they've set a precedent. and a future president can be charged with something, and neither party wants that to happen. Also, they don't want to inspire his followers, of whom there's still many millions of people. So I don't think they're going to touch Trump at all. It's all meant to keep us bamboozled and forget all the things that we just talked about. But no, they are what they are. And as the system, as the crisis deepens, they will get worse. They just move to the right more. So what does left and right mean? You know, politics in this country is more and more conservative. Today's Democrats are like the old moderate Republicans of yesteryear.
Yeah.
And as you know, as we just talked about, they don't even protect those issues that are most important to Democrats. So no, they won't do anything differently. Would Trump win again? Could he win again? I mean, he's a very divisive figure. I think his presence would increase the turnout for Democrats. So I don't think it's likely he would win, although he barely won in the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton was so sure. I like to remind people, she thought he was easiest to beat. She didn't take him seriously, the Pied Piper strategy. She wanted the press to elevate Trump because she thought he'd be the easiest to beat if he got the nomination. She didn't replicate. Obama had a great get out the vote effort. She didn't bother. So 78,000 votes in 3 states made the difference and kept her from being president. So all that to say, I think it's unlikely he could be elected again, but who knows? And even if he were, I would not be in a panic if Donald Trump were president.
I mean, it doesn't bother me at all because we're already operating outside of this whole binary in the first place. A lot of that has to do with, you can tell where people are getting the information from, and it has a lot to do with the brainwashing you were talking about. It's crazy, like Russia Today. I used to follow Russia Today all the time, and I follow all these different publications. And I'm saying to myself, so who determines that that's not a legitimate publication? So you're just going to take it down as if we've never had conflict ideologically or kinetic with other countries before, and you're going to justify that by taking down an entire publication that's with U.S. journalists as well. It wasn't like it's just completely Russian journalists. I mean, a lot of those people, Chris Hedges and
the left has been, what the little bit of left narrative that was in the media has been censored completely. And why can't you watch Russia Today if you watch RT if you want to? Who's to decide that you can't? I mean, you have governments, you know, how you look on Twitter and other countries, they'll say this is Chinese state-controlled media, this is Russian state-controlled media. Well, our corporate media is state-controlled. The British media is state-controlled. BBC, it should say British state-controlled media because that's what it is. And they work with big tech. So we see them go along with whatever the state wants. And I don't know if you remember when Biden was running in 2020 and this scandal broke out with his dumb son who was drug addict and lost his laptop. Twitter would not allow, and Facebook would not allow you to link to any stories about Hunter Biden. And it was like, well, why can't people read about Hunter Biden? Let them decide for themselves. And by the way, he never denied that the laptop was his and the emails were real. But we see how they work together. So it's totalitarianism. We talk about authoritarian governments. Well, you know, it looks to me that that's how we're living right now, too.
That's exactly what's going on. Speaking of the media you were just talking about, it concerned me something, not what my friend posted. There's been about 20 of my friends over this summer. They keep sharing this graphic. It's called the media bias chart, and the company is called Ad Fontes Media. I actually reached out and talked to a couple of those people myself. I was concerned when I saw the graphic, and Black Agenda Report was actually on it.
Oh, really? Send it to me.
I will. I actually copied it to my computer so I can send it to you later. The gray zone, like a lot of the people I follow are on there. And it's crazy. They have CNN and all these like fake news outlets. They're all up at the top, which is supposed to be, the higher you up, it's supposed to be the more legitimate, the more factual and analysis and not opinionated. And I'm saying to myself, you have Black Agenda Report at the very bottom. They had you viewed as, I have it here, they consider you selective, incomplete, unfair, persuasive, and full of propaganda. Basically, they had you in that column on the very bottom in the far left. And I'm saying to myself, that should kill the legitimacy, but no one sees it because they're already operating within the corporate news narrative. So of course, the one Black left outlet, you're going to try to make it seem like it's completely propaganda.
Well, you know, the New York Times is propaganda. I mean, they have the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. They say whatever the state tells them to say. And they, you know, ally themselves with one wing of the ruling class, the Democratic Party wing of the ruling class, but it's all the ruling class. And their goal is to silence anybody else. They don't want another narrative, excuse me, to be heard on a whole plethora of issues. And you know, we see people under attack, people who are kicked off of social media, who are just banned from YouTube or Twitter because the whole foundation is shaky. If even a handful of people are able to communicate freely with the public. And this is where we are living right now. This is authoritarianism that we're always told applies to some other country. I saw recently someone said, as a friend of mine, that authoritarian countries are the ones that won't do what the U.S. tells them to do. That's all it means, you know, and the others are just U.S. vassal states. But we have to defend our rights to express ourselves, defend people who are targeted by the state, defend Julian Assange, defend I don't know if you're following the story, the African People's Socialist Party, the FBI raids last week.
Yeah, I was following that, yeah.
Yeah, claims of Russian influence, and they're just Black people who say they can speak to whomever they want and can espouse whatever beliefs they want. So they indict a man in Russia who will never be touched. I mean, the whole thing is a farce. The goal is to impugn people and organizations here. So you indict somebody you can't touch and claim that they're, you know, practicing Russian influence. And it even extends to the Black political class that we talk about on Black Agenda Report. There's a bill in Congress now, the Russian Malign Influence in Africa Act. And
unbelievable.
Sponsored by a Congressional Black Caucus member, Gregory Meeks, who's chair of House Foreign Relations Committee, which says that the government should report on Russia's influence in Africa and around the African diaspora. And to what end? Why? African nations are independent and sovereign. They can talk to whomever they want. Individuals can talk to whomever they want. But this goes back to Russiagate, and the point of pushing that was to silence people about imperialism, about austerity. And that's what we're talking about, the austerity that says there's not going to be any Build Back Better. No, you don't get the child tax credit again. No, we're not raising the minimum wage. All of these things work together against the people.
100%. I think you sort of alluded to it just based on what you've said, but I want my audience to sort of get a clarification as far as what you mean when you say Black misleadership class, because I was reading the latest op-ed, Glen Force Irreplaceable Journalism that you wrote, and you've used it in pretty much all the interviews I've ever followed you with, and you've always used the term Black misleadership class. Did you coin that term? What does that come from? And what exactly does that mean?
Well, that's a Black Agenda Report term. I can't remember. I can't remember if Glen or Bruce. I wish I could credit. Sometimes we say the Black political class, but these are the people who were set up as a buffer class. in the days of the liberation movement, as that was being destroyed, one of the ways in which it was destroyed, sometimes with brute force, as in COINTELPRO and making people political prisoners, but there's a soft power arm too, co-optation, allowing some Black people to enter the system to some degree, people who are elected to public office, funding institutions. And these are people who are given prominence because they're not going to do, precisely because they're not going to do anything for Black people. So they're figureheads, they're professional figureheads. I guess that's the best way to sum it up. And that definitely applies to the Congressional Black Caucus. There was a time, and before the influence of money played such a big role in politics, that they were called the conscience of the Congress and the most progressives. Now progressive doesn't mean anything. The so-called progressives say they're, you know, and a Republican's is in office. So Trump, they'll go through the motions and say, we are going to raise the minimum wage. We'll do this, we'll do that. Biden comes in, and what do? They tweet. They go on Twitter and say, what would it mean to you and your family to have affordable health care? And they know that people want Medicare for all. They know that's what people want. That's why they say these things. But they have no intention of doing it. It's meant to keep you from looking outside of the duopoly, for looking to another formation for answers, for questioning the system and the way they work within it. So the Black political class, they do what they do. They, you know, they take, I just talked about the money that you need to win public office. For example, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, who is, you know, this phony kingmaker. It's like, it's such a joke. He picked Biden because they all picked Biden. It was like, so
Joe knows us. Joe Biden knows us.
Clyburn gets more money from Big Pharma than any other member of Congress. And that one little factoid tells you all you need to know about the Black political class, that they will never, you can't take money from Big Pharma and support Medicare for all. So that
conflict
is
of interest.
Of course, you can't, you know, bite the hand that feeds you. So that's where we are with the Black political class. They don't represent us. They represent other interests and their figureheads, giving people the impression that they are being, none of us are represented by people in Congress. None of us. They don't, look what they've done. Nobody says all this money going for Ukraine, and there are like a handful of no votes. I mean, all of them say yes, 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 yes. And it's how many billion? $50 billion now? I can't keep track of what it is. It's this unanimity of opinion. There used to be a few people who would push back, who would question, who would go through the motions of saying something, but that's a long time ago now.
Yeah. We could talk about a lot of the stuff we're doing here a lot longer, but I did want to talk about Prejudential some. I'll have to tell you, I'll give you a testimony myself just after I read it, because I am a professor, I'm an educator. And so I guess my opinion matters a little bit. This book, the readability of the book is what stood out to me. This book should be required reading from middle school up into higher education. I'm not even lying. Like, the book should be because it's easy to read. It's straight to the point. There's no beating around the bush. And I like those sections where you have, maybe after 5 president descriptions, you have sort of like these bullet points and dates and important moments of history. What inspired you to write this book, Prejudential, Black American Presidents?
It was a suggestion from a friend and supporter of Black Agenda Report. I had written a column about Theodore Roosevelt. There had been a public television documentary about the Roosevelt family and how wonderful Teddy Roosevelt was, and he was so brilliant and blah, blah, blah. So I wrote this column about how horrible he was to Black people, how he, for example, he court-martialed a group of Black soldiers who had been accused of murder. He waited till after Election Day. And in those days, Black people voted for Republicans. So he waited till after Election Day and then court-martialed all of them. And that's just an example of, and he was an open white supremacist and talked about how white women needed to have a lot of babies. I mean, seriously, all those things. Anyway, so after writing this column, I was encouraged to write a book. And I said yes, and it's very funny because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I'd never written a book before, but the important thing about that is sometimes we can do things we don't think we can do, and it goes back to being encouraged to stretch and do different things. But yeah, the book it's now 2 years old, which for a book is old, but I think it stands the test of time. And I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, so the only way I can write is in a way that people can easily understand and relate to. Someone said to me, the best compliment I got was that it was a brisk read. And I like that description. That's what I wanted to achieve. It's about 200 pages long. It's not too long. But it's a lot of work writing a book. I can prove everything I say. You have to have sources to back up your contention. But the point of the book is that America foundationally is anti-Black, and it starts from the very beginning. I start with George Washington. He and his wife Martha owned 200 people. They there's so many things that we're not taught, or things that we're just lied to about. So why would you build a new city to have a capital? Why would you need a new city? Washington, D.C. was Thomas Jefferson built it. New York was the first capital where Washington was inaugurated. Then it moved further south to Philadelphia, then further south to a new city between Maryland and Virginia.
Conveniently.
Yes, of course. But for example, Washington had a problem when the capital was in Philadelphia. There was a law in Pennsylvania. Any enslaved person in the state for more than 6 months could sue for their freedom. This was a problem for a big slaveholder. So he rotated people, the people he held, to make sure none of them stayed in Philadelphia for 6 months. One young lady managed to escape from them, and they did everything they could to try to get her back. One person out of more than 200. So that is so anyway, so yes, you need a capital city that is firmly in the region that is most dependent on the slaveocracy system. And yes, there was slavery in the North, but the South was more dependent on the plantation economy. So you build a new city. But nobody ever tells you why they built a new city. They already had cities. Why would you need a new one? We see from the beginning, Washington held slaves, literally took the teeth out of their mouths to put in his dentures. And I want to say this about independence, July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, they declared the biggest reasons they wanted to be independent from Britain. They were always afraid the British would end slavery, would end the slave trade. And they wanted to keep spreading across the continent. They wanted to snatch up more and more indigenous land and get the whole continent. And the British had made treaties with the French, which made that impractical. They had treaties with some of the indigenous nations. The French and Indian War is what we were taught in school, was 7 Years' War. It's complicated, but Britain told the colonists, who were all on the east coast of the United States, they could not settle past the Appalachian Mountains because that created problems for them. They didn't want to hear that. They wanted it all. So Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark exploring the West, they wanted to explore the whole thing so they could snatch it all. The Louisiana Purchase, which ironically came about because of the Haitian Revolution. And France needed money and sold those territories. But what was that for? An irony of history. They also spread the territory where slavery could spread across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, those are some of the beginnings of the country. Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He never gave up his dream of getting Black people out of the country. He was pushed to say the Civil War was about slavery because enslaved people pushed the issue by every time they could escape to Union lines, they did so. So he had to. It was Black people pressured him into doing that, but he never gave up wanting to send Black people out of the country. In fact, there was a short-lived colony in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
He always had these plans. And so after emancipation, you see Black people, it's an old story, right? Clinging to the Republican Party. Frederick Douglass famously said, the Republicans, I'm messing this up. All else is the sea. They are the ship and all else is the sea. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
But we behave that way now, except now it's the Democrats.
Other way around.
And there was always this disappointment. White people lost their interest in protecting Black people. So we had Reconstruction and the rise of the reaction against emancipation. And then there's, on and on and on, Plessy versus Ferguson, Republican after Republican, hopes that they would do right by Black people. Then sometimes you elect a Democrat, FDR, who did nothing, who hated to be associated with Black people. Mm-hmm. Eleanor Roosevelt would, have tea with Mary McLeod Bethune, but that's all it amounted to. So that's our struggle. We are the ones who struggled. When we have won victories, they're our victories. They're the victories of the masses of people and not this or that president who was quote unquote good for Black people. And the 1960s, everybody fetishizes what is usually called the civil rights movement, but that's because of mass struggle. Black people in the South, the ones who couldn't vote, ended up getting the vote for everybody. Of course, now we've lost it thanks to the Democratic Party and their lack of interest, frankly, in protecting our rights. But that is the most important thing to remember. And in the days when Bill Clinton was elected, I was still a Democrat. I was happy to, that he won. I'm so embarrassed that I felt that way.
Me too.
I mean, he, from the beginning, he had this photo op with Black men in prison and the crime bill and all of these horrible things that he and Hillary Clinton, his partner in crime, did to Black people. Barack Obama, who won because he assured white people that Black people weren't going to have a voice, that I'm the president of all the people, a rising tide lifts all boats. He made it clear. Mm-hmm. He was not going to give us any sort of consideration. Excuse me. And but the racism of many white people maintained support for him because, there'd always be some Yahoo congressman calling him a liar, or Rush Limbaugh or somebody like that. But he worked for the oligarchy too. That's what these people do. They're errand boys and girls for the people who really run the country.
I got censored basically for saying that Kamala Harris and Barack Obama that's what blackface is now. You don't even need a white person to use it. You just put a dark skinned person's face on it. And I'm like that. I'm very upfront and transparent. But to me, it has that function of blackface where you're doing the work. You're doing the dirty work for the ruling class. And how's that translating down to everyday Black people, everyday people in general, everyday working people? These people's superficial representation, the way it's used is superficially. How does that help us at all when it comes to the day-to-day struggles? I mean, it doesn't at all.
Well, they're part of our problem. Kamala Harris made a name for herself by sending Black people to jail. She was a prosecutor. And she's not even smart. Have you watched any of these visitors? She cannot talk off the cuff. It's very odd for a politician. It's something most politicians do with ease. She cannot speak off the cuff. Every time she's unscripted, she sounds like an idiot.
Goes off the rails.
Oh my God, it's terrible. You remember Dan Quayle, who was
Potato Man?
Bush the Elder's vice president. Everybody talked about how dumb he was. Well, she's Dan Quayle in a dress, as far as I'm concerned. She is so in over her head. It's kind of odd. I mean, I know her politics are not ours, but she seems to not even be a competent person. And talk about not competent, Biden.
Oh my God, Jim Crow Joe,
who is not well, and I'm not referring to his recent COVID positive test. I'm talking about his mental state. He has dementia, and I generally think lay people shouldn't make these statements, but it's so obvious that he's not well. And so we're in trouble. And even if he didn't survive office, we'd be even worse off with Kamala Harris.
I know.
I am convinced.
I'm 100% sure of that too, because they will use the symbolism, like I was talking about the symbolism, they would use that as a way to get undercover stuff done, like there's even more nefarious as we could ever think about. I mean, the Democrats do very nefarious things. Don't be fooled by they have a third Black people in this chamber and the Congressional Black Caucus. That means absolutely nothing at all to most people. That's what they tell you on TV that's important. But representation can be over abused too. And that's not the type of representation I want. I want fairness in other ways, not the whole visual effect.
You want substance.
Substance, exactly.
All the things they say they won't do. People, the thing that one of so many things I don't like about Biden, he lied so much because they know what people want. They know people want student loan debt relief, and he promised some form of it. He said he would raise the minimum wage. All of these things that people need, they just lied about. They knew they weren't going to do it. This stimulus bill where this COVID money went everywhere. They're building prisons with COVID money. And now what's his big campaign thing? What does he talk about all the time? Police. $30 billion for police, it's just a racist dog whistle. That's all it is. That's the last thing we need are more police, but it's a message to white people, or an attempted message to white people, but he's messed up so much, nobody really likes him. Only the, Democratic Party dead enders will. I fully expect the Democrats to lose in the midterm election in November, but this will be after Joe Biden gives cops $30 billion, 2 years after these protests where people were demanding the change to policing. All he talks about is giving money to cops. This is not something good for Black people. That's all I can say.
Well, like I was telling people, I have some Trump associates, and I told them, I'll be straight up with you. If I had to choose between the two with the gun to my head, I'd choose Trump only because Biden has done way worse legislatively. He wrote the crime bill. People are like sitting here in their dream state, and we will talk about Prejudential after this, because I really don't like talking about the guy, but I want the audience to at least get to know how evil this guy is. He started the crime bill in 1981. All this stuff is on congress.gov. He started drafting the crime bill in 1981, 13 years before it actually went into effect. And that 94 crime bill increased 100,000 cops. That's what it did. Immediately on the streets, 100,000 more police, and just, kept the mass incarceration going and going just exponentially. And he's always been, if you're a Trump person, and I'm saying to myself, if you're all about the Republicans, you should love Joe Biden. He does everything that you want him to do.
Yes.
I don't know why they seem like, he does everything you want him to do. And you should be his friend.
Sure he does. But that's, been his whole, as you point out, his whole political career. Aside from, what did Trump do? He just stirred up the racist id of the country and put it up front. But it's always there. We don't get not racist presidents. We don't. We get people who their narrative is different one from another. And that's it. That's all we get. We got 1 year of stimulus money, and then it was over. That's what we got from Biden. And foreign policy, he is worse than Trump. Trump wasn't, I never felt like, we were at the verge of World War III with Trump. It's, as I said, they mess up Ukraine and then say, okay, let's try to start something with China. It's really, and the New York Times recently wrote about that, how Biden has continued Trump foreign policy, and I said I predicted that before he was inaugurated.
It wasn't hard to see.
No, New York Times has just caught up with me. So that's what we have, and I think people need to have some courage and not be afraid to just start with the question. It's like, is this all there is? Is this really the best we can get? Is there nothing else we can have? Do we just have to accept any crumbs? The Democrat, I don't even think they give crumbs anymore.
And insult the crumbs.
Yeah, so I want people to be brave, because this is a time we're going to need to be, because these people live in a sick fantasy where the US can just get its way all over. And look what they've done with Ukraine. Their effort to sanction Russia has damaged the economy of the entire world. The entire world. People pay more for fuel all over the world. US allies like Germany have done themselves in because they won't free themselves from the United States. They depend on Russian natural gas, and now they're rationing energy. I mean, look at what they have done. But that's because the system is in crisis. They don't know any other way to be. They don't want to be any. They want the US to control everything. So even though everything they do brings China and Russia closer together, guides other countries to look towards this new axis, they still think that they can get their way. And that is very, very dangerous.
I think it's interesting, just the perception of places. I follow a lot of my African friends, and people in Africa, especially the sub-Saharan Africans that I know, they have very different views about Russia. Like their narrative, the narrative that's here, they say that Russia's never invaded us. Like they haven't.
Well,
Russia's never sanctioned the continent of Africa. So they use all these points to make. And the NATO people who use the NATO talking points, you like to basically pretend like it's still the Soviet Union. They're still operating like it's in the 80s. Still.
Yeah, well, of course they would do that. But who destroyed the nation of Libya? Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, an ongoing humanitarian crisis. AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, controlling the militaries of African countries. And they're right. Who carved up Africa? Europeans, British and French, and Germans, and Portuguese. All caused this havoc that Africans are still living with. The chairman of the African Union a couple months ago went to Russia to meet with Putin. Why? Because the sanctions against Russia, like kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, made it hard for African countries to pay for the grain and pay for the fertilizer that they get from Russia. So they are hurt by these efforts. So Africans, this claims that China is a malign influence in Africa and Russia's a malign influence. All that means is
they can't get in there.
Right. They want to make sure nobody else gets there. That's all it means. And people in these other countries know what's good for themselves, and they can decide what they want, and they should be able to do so without any interference.
Yeah, I think the brainwashing is so deep in this country, and it's just, I just sit back and almost just get my popcorn out and just let them talk because it's amazing. Like, do you realize that you're copying what the mainstream media is saying? Like, you're telling me you don't even have to read a newspaper anymore. Just go outside and your neighbor screams you all the fake news that's out there right now, it seems like, because they get so absorbed by it.
Sure. And it's, most people depend on corporate media. They aren't aware of these things, that many of these things that we have been discussing. And people are, talk about Russian propaganda or influence. We're the most propagandized country in the world. I am convinced.
100%.
And it's the countries of the so-called West that are Britain sanctioned an independent journalist, took his assets, took his house. Recently, Germany's threatening a reporter with jail time because she has a different narrative about Ukraine. This is everything that it's projection. Basically, everything they say about someone else is really about them. So when they talk about authoritarianism or censorship or this or that, it's they're really talking about themselves. And as the crisis deepens, this is going to be more and more common because hegemon can't not be a hegemon. So they can't change course. They can't reform themselves. That's the only existence they know about. And so they take a chance on invading Iraq, on a coup in Ukraine or a war in Ukraine or starting something with China. As far as they are concerned, that's the only world that exists. And if they can't be a hegemon, then the whole thing has to be destroyed. They're willing to do that.
I want to make a comment about, I was talking to my son last week, and I actually had him reading parts of Prejudential. And the part that astonished me, in the year 1900, I think the life expectancy for Black people was 33 years old and 48 for whites. It just really stood with me. And it resonated with my son. And he sort of scratched his head for a second. And it just made him, because he came in with a whole different thought process. I think he said 65 or something, because a kid's going to think, 65 years old, a person's going to live.
Well, I mean, we still have a lower life expectancy than white people. We are overrepresented in every negative measure and underrepresented in any positive measure. Income, inherited wealth, likelihood of going to jail,
homelessness.
Homelessness. We're like 14 or 15% of the population. Like half of the homeless people in the country are Black. How we're treated if we go for healthcare. We're still treated bad when we go to doctors or have to end up in the hospital. All of these are these dynamics are still seen, still quite visible. And we're still victims of racism all the time. They'll write these articles like, why do Black people make so much money? And they're scratching their heads. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe racism, maybe people are discriminated against. You ever think of that? But, that doesn't work for the narrative. But we have to see the continuum and ask ourselves how we can change it. It has to be very radical change. All we'll get is more of the same. I mean, look at how people are living. I was reading recently that young adults are more likely to live with their families now. And I'm like, well, of course, gig work, if you don't have a living wage job, and they'll say, oh, young people aren't buying cars. I'm like, how can you buy a car on a insecure small salary? So I feel like younger people really have gotten a raw deal. People my age actually got the better, deal. But yeah, that is it's something to be aware of and to accept the need for radical change. Nothing is going to improve with the same old, same old. It'll just be a continuing downward trend.
We're closed with the viewer question, and it's a question that I sort of had as well. Is there any hope in the future, the near future that is, for a third party presence that also diverges with Black centered issues like reparations and this wealth gap? Do you see that marriage ever happening?
Well, that's an old argument about a Black independent political party, which is like an old idea. There was a convention in Gary, Indiana, it was the 50th anniversary, I believe, this year. I don't know. I really think I really think I don't think it's realistic to expect a political party that is just oriented towards Black people. I know we've got to get rid of this duopoly. I know that.
Absolutely.
And a Black political party has to be radical. I'll put it that way. It has to be radical. It can't stop with just Black faces in high places. It can't be just about reparations. We need socialism. Just to sum up, that's what we need. We need where we live under billionaire rule. We don't have democracy. We need real democracy. And the country becomes less and less democratic as time goes on. So we've got to push radical politics, radical solutions, and mass action. I would say those are the things that we need, and we have to get rid of this duopoly. Trying to change it from within, change it from inside. They don't want to change.
No,
so that's, the people selling that are just trying to put you back to sleep.
Well, I think that's an appropriate closing. Margaret, is there anything else you want to tell my audience? How can they reach you on social media? The easiest place?
Sure. So read blackagendareport.com every week. We have a new issue every Wednesday. I'm on Twitter. Freedom Ride blog is my Twitter handle. You can buy my book, Prejudential. You can get it from Amazon. I'd prefer you buy it straight from the publisher, Steerforth Press. That's steerforth.com. And so yeah, those are the best places to see what I read, what I write and talk about.
Awesome. She has tons of columns that come out, trust me. So make sure you're following Margaret Kimberley. And I'm going to link your book as well to that publisher that you mentioned, because I don't like using Amazon as well. I'll link it to all my episode descriptions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.